the time. So let me see if, okay, so now we're on record. So this is 2:39. And before I begin, I would like to know if I'm audible enough. So can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yes, Doc.
But am I loud enough?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Okay, so that means my microphone is it's not doing badly. So at this point, let me share my screen. In our last class, we listened to Dr. Baku in his lecture on the Enlightenment. I didn't want to say much about that lecture because I knew from past experience that that lecture is a very good precursor to this one. That lecture is a very good precedent, because somehow today's lecture is something like a protest to that lecture. Now, that lecture was giving you all the ideas about modernism, how modernism emerged, the Enlightenment. Of course, you know that the Enlightenment is the origin of modernism. I'm going to elaborate more on that at the introductory stages of this class. And you can see from the title of this paper that this is about postmodernism. And particularly, this paper is not just about postmodernism, but the challenges of the quantitative approach and the grand narratives. Now, so let's begin from the Enlightenment, where we stopped last week. From the lecture last week, you could see that the Enlightenment was somewhat a transition from religious to natural explanations for things. Before the Enlightenment, most of the natural phenomena were explained in terms of divinities, the influence of the divine on human affairs. But there began some kind of transition from explaining natural phenomena in religious terms to explaining natural phenomena in natural terms. So modernism is the idea that through natural explanations, we could improve the world by bringing it under control. In fact, the central idea of modernism is that control is key to development. Once you have control, then you can grow. Everything begins by control. That idea came from the Industrial Revolution in England, because England witnessed this emergence of mechanical progress. You know, these fitting shops in England, they were tinkering a lot with mechanical devices, and eventually they started manufacturing, or, well, you can't say manufacture. They started making devices that could run on their own, by which I mean machines. That technically we now call the Industrial Revolution. So this idea of machinery started there. And when machines began to arrive, when machines began to show up, they came with the idea that, control, we could somehow control the universe. Now, we had been advancing our working tools to the extent that some of them had become combustion machines, running on their own and churning out more production than human hands. We were inventing more machines to deal with an increasing number of areas in our lives. So machines were growing, their uses were growing, their areas of application were growing. It was not just about vehicles, it was about so many other things. So it was a successful and progressive mechanization of the world.
My presentation, I thought it's going to be something simple. The
So
binding.
I need to mute you. James, you need to put off your mic, but let me put it off myself. So the major inspiration from the industrial age is that we could build systems and allow those systems to run the world. So just consider this idea. We could build systems and allow those systems to run the world. That's a very smart, that's a very smart move, you know. Since this was doing fine, at least in technology, we probably could build systems in other areas of life, and those systems will give us the same results as they are giving us in advanced technology. So, in technology, man saw, or people saw that you could erect something, and that thing you have erected would be doing a lot of work, and then you just go and relax. You could predict the world, structure it, program it, you know, and then just press the button, and the rest will be control, production, you know. So it was a very exciting idea. That idea began to, or human beings began to consider that idea in other areas of life apart from technology. So that's what we call the origin of structuralism. Structuralism is the idea that the world is a system of interconnected parts. All we need to understand the world is to observe it as a system and erect theoretical structures that adequately describe it in such a way that everything happening in the world could be explained by those structures. So ultimately, this idea came from technology. The scope of structuralism. Now, due to the successes of structuring in the science and technology, scholars began building structures in various disciplines. So, in the social sciences and humanities, these structures were in the form of grand theories, attempting to reduce the world to a mechanical device we can understand in order to manipulate. Now, structuralism to grand narratives. So, theories explaining where humanity were heading. There were several theories emerging in the humanities. George F. Hegel said the world is in a dialectical movement and that the world was heading dialectically towards a liberal and rational state. So Hegel believed, at least from his own observations of his own societies, he said all societies were heading to a state that will be increasingly liberal and rational. And then subsequent philosophers attempted to use this movement to build their own theories. For example, Marxism. Marxism was the idea that the whole world is heading towards a classless society and that the dictatorship of the workers through a series of contradictions. You know, so moving from, what do you call it? Is it serfdom to capitalism, and then from feudalism to capitalism, and then from capitalism through a series of contradictions to socialism. And then more contradictions will push the world to a classless society where the workers who reign supreme. Okay. Now, the pitfalls of structuralism. Now, Marxism is the first theory to show that structuralism in the humanities could go terribly wrong. When some countries adopted Marxism, they found it was not supported by the progress of history. and that human actions did not entirely fit into its predictions. So the early attempts, such as the one we saw in the USSR and China, to force humanity to conform to these predictions resulted in a lot of bloodshed. So the emerging lesson was that structuralism in understanding human affairs is not the same as structuralism in understanding technology. So you can see that some major differences began to emerge between technology and human affairs, at least as far as structuralism and structuralists were concerned. Now, before we go on, let's look at two other grand narratives. There were other grand narratives that were gaining progress. The first one was that the whole world was heading towards a liberal democracy. So the whole world was gradually resembling the West. So these are two other grand narratives, getting more and more liberal and then resembling the West more and more. Now, both are only partially correct as it began to turn out, because most societies were modernizing by mixing with Western ideas with their own, but not neglecting their own. So some researches have emerged showing that in some selected societies, you see that this society is modernizing, but they are not exactly throwing away their traditions. And then there are two economic narratives, which is another good example of grand narratives. The first one.
Hello, sir. We are not hearing you.
Yeah, but I was asking that question. I asked if I was audible enough, and you said yes.
So it will be to some people, because I can hear very clearly.
It's loud and clear, so I can hear
Yes,
from this
I can
end.
also hear very clearly.
Loud and clear.
Okay, so that means it will boil down to internet network differences. Some people's networks would be weaker than that of others. Yeah, so whatever is the case, if it is not as loud for you as it is for your colleagues, then you would at least will have the advantage that you can watch the videos later on, So at least the one that is being recorded for the videos will be loud enough, because the video is taking it, Zoom is recording that one. And so if some people can hear me clearly, then surely the video version will be loud enough. Okay, so let's move on. Well, another remark, if I try to raise the volume of my voice, then it might be creating, for those already hearing me loudly, if I raise my voice further, it might begin to jar or shake the microphone, and then you'll be hearing this jarring sound, So it's fine. You watch the video later, those who have network challenges. Okay, so two economic narratives. So these are also grand narratives. You have classical economics. Of course, you must have heard of classical economics by now. Society improves automatically when human beings are simply allowed to trade freely among themselves. This prediction ran completely contrary to that of Marxism, which was that it is only when everything is state-owned, regulated, and distributed that the world will develop to higher heights. So you had Marxism on the one hand saying that everything should be owned by the state, and then you had classical economics on the other hand saying everything should be, or almost everything should be privately owned, or as much as possible should be privately owned. So there was a battle between these two grand narratives. That part of that battle was, of course, the Cold War. You had the US, the Soviet Union versus the United States and UK. And they were fighting for the ideological allegiance of other countries. The Soviets and the Chinese were looking for people that would believe in their grand narrative. The Americans were also, there were these some of the things that happened in Africa had those undertones. You know, some of our first presidents were socialists. You can say Marxists, and then they were not in the good books of the US. And you must have heard of stories of how the CIA was undermining their leadership in those days. You know, so all those things, those were two grand narratives. But it does appear that none of those grand narratives was entirely true. You know, so look at the last section of the slide. The contradiction between the two systems was an insight, although it wasn't realized quickly, that systems may not work in social life as they work in technology. Okay, let's go to the postmodern turn. Scholars gradually began to object to the presumed predictable power of grand narratives and theories explaining the world. So that protest is now called postmodernism. It was
excuse me, we are not hearing you.
Sorry, watch the video. Okay, so the protest spanned the entire range of life activities, from philosophy and politics to architecture, religion, feminism, technology, post-colonialism, fiction, music, lifestyles, popular culture, activism, and dissent. So that protest, the postmodern protest, was taking place across a good number of sections in life and even academic disciplines. Now, the argument of postmodernism. Postmodernists rejected the cultural certainties that have come to structure life in the Western world for the past few centuries, especially the central idea of progress, especially when applied to certain areas of life. Now, the Enlightenment project of liberating Europe from the shackles of political oppression and economic want had itself become authoritarian and oppressive in trying to force human beings and societies into ways of thought and action that are not always in their best interests. So now, this second paragraph was one of the most potent arguments of postmodernists against modernism. They were saying that the Enlightenment project, which we saw in our last class, of liberating Europe from, political oppression. You heard Dr. Baku telling you about what did he call it? The divine right of kings. The theory that kings had a divine right to rule. So that was political oppression, economic want. The Enlightenment had arrived to liberate people from those things. The postmodernists were saying that the Enlightenment itself became authoritarian and oppressive in trying to force human beings and societies into ways of thought and action that are not always in their best interests. And then the post-structuralists rejected structuralism. That is the tendency to see the world as a system with interconnected parts. And then they also rejected the understanding that the world is a kind of mechanism. The understanding of the world, or rather the mechanistic understanding of the world. The world is a machine. Their argument was that mechanistic understanding underrepresented free will, or rather didn't give allowance for the possibility of free will. And that, like the grand narratives, it saw the world as working in a pre-programmed way. Now, that protest against structuralism is now called post-structuralism. Now let's look at the differences in theoretical approach. Structuralism focuses on similarity and interconnectedness, but post-structuralism focuses on difference and open-endedness. So that's the difference. Similarity and interconnectedness versus difference and open-endedness. Now, structuralism focuses on regularity of experience, but post-structuralism focuses on content, the content of experience. Now, you know, because technology deals with control, control itself thrives on the idea of regularity. But if you are to depart from that, if you are to depart from the idea of regularity, looking for regularity in the humanities, then you are actually more interested in the content of experience, not universal regularities. Now, when you are concerned with the idea of regularity, especially global regularity, you tend to arrive at sweeping generalizations. You tend to say that, you know, everyone is going to do this, everyone will end up like this, everyone is going in that direction, everyone is going to take this step, ultimately everyone is going to end there. That's the idea of regularity. But that idea, although it is useful in technology, it misses certain very crucial aspects of human experience. And so those who are rejecting the idea of regularity, which is actually the idea driving these grand narratives, capitalism, socialism, you know, neoliberalism, they were advocating for more focus on the content of human experience. So instead of looking at the world from a very distant, you come closer, go to individual societies and look at the content of their experience. Then the post-structuralists opposed the universalizing tendencies of the structuralists. There were also similar transitions. You have the transition from modernity to post-modernity. Now, talking about the transition from modernity to post-modernity is similar to the transition from the quantitative to mixed approaches in social sciences and humanities. Now, by now, some of you are familiar with the two terms quantitative and qualitative approach to research. So I'm going to go into that so that you see how it is related to the transition from modernity to postmodernity. Now, the very idea of modernity is the idea of precision, measurement, theorizing, structure, and prediction. That idea is called the quantitative approach. The quantitative approach. So now the quantitative approach is reminiscent of precision in science and technology, and it was transited to social studies. It encourages you to formulate hypotheses and test data for conformity to your hypothesis. The problem with the method is that it is limited to the reasoning of the researcher, because the researcher is not interested in the reasoning of the recipients or the objects of research. Because of that, because the researcher is the only one involved in the reflection, the hypothesis may not be well formed, at least in social studies. So that weakness is reminiscent of the weakness in grand narratives. Remember that the major weakness of grand narratives is that they didn't study human societies very well to appreciate the diversity in experience, so that they avoid their sweeping generalizations. So like the grand narratives, the quantitative method also is not very good in being informed about the content of human experience. Now let's look at the rationale for the qualitative approach. So the quantitative approach underestimates free will. When studying social systems, it is necessary to investigate the reasoning process and motivations of people. And that is why you have the qualitative approach. So the qualitative approach emerged because there needs to be an approach that can go closer to people, ask them open-ended questions so that people can lay bare the content of their minds. The quantitative approach doesn't have that. It just tells you yes or no, answer yes or no, based on certain questions that have been formulated from the reflections of the researcher. You had to answer yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And then the researcher will just collate the data and tabulate the quantity of people that have said yes and the quantity of people that have said no. But that is really a question that is limited to the reflection of the researcher. The researcher doesn't know much about the people in order to give rise to probably better questions. So that informed the emergence of the qualitative approach. So there was the need to balance the determinism of the quantitative with the free will ambience of the qualitative. Now let's look at human will and volition. So there's this debate about determinism and free will. According to determinism, people under the same influence will respond in approximately the same ways. But according to free will, people under the same influence could respond in different ways, thanks to the capacity for choice. Two people could be hungry. Determinism says both of them will tend to eat. But free will says one could eat, the other could fast, with different reasons. Now, so science and structuralism work with determinism, but the humanities considers it better to work with starting assumptions of free will. Now, let's make another distinction of terminologies between the context-neutral and the context-dependent approaches. Now, the natural sciences are context neutral. What do we mean by context neutral? You measure a table here, that measurement is likely to meet the same, you measure a table here, that measurement is likely to remain the same, even if you transport the table to London. So irrespective of whether the same table is here or in China or in South America, the measurement of that table will remain the same. So in a way, the objects of study of the natural sciences are context neutral. That's what we mean by context neutral. On the other hand, if you try to measure or analyze a human attitude, it is not as certain to meet the same attitude in future. So you measure a human attitude right now, come back and measure it tomorrow, you're not likely to meet the same attitude. That's because human beings learn and make decisions based on their own behavior. So the humanities are concerned with the context-dependent phenomena. So that makes the humanities a context-dependent discipline or area of study. So it is a major difference between the humanities and the natural sciences. Now let's make another distinction between closed and open systems. The natural world deals with a closed system due to the ease of measurement and predictability. Now, because the measurement and predictability of the natural world is more or less fixed, we say that the natural world is a closed system, but the social world is an open system because of the difficulty in measuring and predicting human behavior. So natural systems are closed systems, social systems are open systems. Now, so the unstructured approaches, the qualitative and hermeneutical approaches, are designed to discover cultural peculiarities. They are designed to discover cultural peculiarities. They are designed to study open systems. The quantitative approaches start by measuring assumptions or hypotheses about people and investigating to confirm or disconfirm those assumptions. But the qualitative approaches shift the researcher's assumptions aside to pay more attention to studying people's assumptions. So you see that in the qualitative approach, there is a shift from the researcher's own assumptions to the assumptions of those he is studying. Now, the shortcoming of the quantitative approach. The quantitative approach is formal, is purely formal in its approach. It focuses on regularity rather than content. So it is a logical approach. Like mathematics, logic is contentless. It's only about structure. We need knowledge about content in addition to knowledge about structure, at least in social studies. Now, the quantitative approaches alone are not completely suitable for open systems. So it is also wrong to assume that open systems are combinations of closed subsystems. So there was this assumption that open systems could be combinations of closed subsystems, but that assumption has been proven to be wrong. An open system is an open system. There is nothing at all closed about an open system. So there's reason for a mixed approach. The quantitative approach is still important. That's the quantitative approach. It's still important because we need to organize our thoughts about human behavior. But the qualitative and hermeneutical approaches are needed to see cultural peculiarities. Those are the methods that will expose the rich variety of cultures around the world. Now, so the qualitative and hermeneutical approaches, the matter of context. Now, the reason why the qualitative and hermeneutical approaches are important is to avoid tearing phenomena out of their context and then treating them as spaceless and timeless data. Now, remember that natural sciences treat their data as spaceless and timeless, but that would be a mistake in the humanities. Now, for the natural sciences, if you test to see the constituent of water, which is hydrogen and oxygen, it does not matter where you are. You could be in any city or town and you could do that experiment. But location matters if we are studying a cultural practice. So example, calling elders by first names. Calling elders by first names. I was in Australia for a while, and I came back in 2017. Up till now, the professors, there's a professor who is roughly 90 years, Professor John Dryzik. He likes me to call him by his first name. But up till now, I've not been able to get around to do that because I don't want to make the mistake of repeating that here. You see that? So there the elders in the West want you to call them by their first names. But the elders around here want you to call them by their titles. You need to be conscious of which one is in force wherever you are so that you don't make the mistake of practicing the other one in the wrong place. So, like I said, location matters if we are studying a cultural practice. Example, calling elders by first names. Context provides an entire gamut of understanding behind a social phenomena. So to study a social phenomena, if you want to understand a social phenomena, you need to study its context very uh, in depth. Now, the rationale for attention for taking context seriously. Social context is a continually changing jumble of spatial phenomena. It involves objects that are often causally related to one another in a continually changing causal web. Regularities in such situations are at best transient. So in social studies, the parameters of a model are fitted to one set of data, but may not to apply to another model. So models, building models in social studies doesn't work very well because models can fit one set of data, but they may not fit another set. That is part of why the grand narratives have not really been working well. Fallacies committed against context. And so copying the West, for instance, in the civil society, in democracy, the multi-party system, comes with its own problems. If we are practicing the multi-party system without studying the context in which it was created or fabricated, then we would have challenges. For instance, in the UK, I was reading that the minority, the political minority in the UK, the party that is not in power in the UK, the main opposition party, has some important say in certain things. So there are certain decisions where the ruling party needs to consult the main opposition party in the UK. And they cannot just dismiss the opinion of the main opposition party. I was reading that thing as recently as last year. I didn't know it for more than 40 years. And I'm not sure many people know about it. But all of us are practicing multi-party democracy. We don't know. So down here, the opposition parties, nobody, the ruling party doesn't listen to them. So we copied it, but we missed out on some of those things. And because we copied it, we just lifted it out of a context. We are practicing it. It is giving problems. If you want to practice it, you have to look at the context thoroughly in which it is being practiced. So yeah, you understand why they were practicing it. And even when we have brought it here, we are practicing it, we have not made an attempt to study it in the context of our own local environment, to see the things that are in friction. So this whole idea of context was totally ignored. No serious homework has been done, but we are still rolling that system. So the purpose of qualitative research is to discover the underlying contextual conflicts. Another mistake we make is to propose traditional practices, the practices of our ancestors for modern practice without adequate grafting. So you see some people saying we should just adopt our traditional systems of governance. Did you study the context in which it is being practiced? Have you compared it to this context? You need to study it closely, context by context, so that you see the things that are in friction. We are not exactly in those times. A lot of things have changed. So just like copying the West, copying tradition is also problematic without context. So whichever one is being done, we need to go down to the roots and study the context. So I'm just giving an example with some of our practices. Now, the qualitative research is meant to help us to see the changing spatial relations, norms, and beliefs. See the changing spatial relations, norms, and beliefs. These things are ever changing because, of course, nothing in the social world is fixed. It's in a constant flux. regularities versus irregularities. So the quantitative approaches are searching for regularities, and then the qualitative approaches are open to irregularities. Natural science, technology, social grand narratives, all of them thrive on the idea of regularities. So what it means is that our own approach must be balanced. Now, in the matter of time and space, natural sciences aim to propound timeless and spaceless natural laws. But the humanities aim to discover the role of space and time in beliefs and practices. So we can't ignore space and time like the natural scientists. On the other hand, we are actually very concerned about space and time. Now, the natural sciences are modernists by procedure, but the humanities scholars are closer to postmodernism, at least procedurally. Now, so you can look at this book, Andrew Sawyer, 1992, Method in Social Science. It's a great book. You can order it on Amazon. So at this point, we can take questions. I'll stop sharing so that we interact before we give ourselves a chance to do other things today. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand. Rashid, are you raising your hand to ask?
Yes, Doc. Yes, Doc. Good afternoon.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Yes, please. I would like you to actually clarify something on the fallacies committed against context. I realize you gave 4 points there. It's towards almost towards the end.
Okay.
Yes, please.
She's committed a good.
Yes, please. Yes, please. Yeah, there are 4 points that you have given here, but in your explanation, I understand the point number 2 and 3 rather as solutions to number 1 and 2. I don't know if you could give a little clarification here.
Yes, you understand copying traditional practices as solution to copying the West.
No, you see, the first point, you said copying the West. And then the second point, you said purpose of qualitative research is to discover the underlying contextual conflict.
Yeah.
And I want to find out if this is also a fallacy as against context.
Fallacy against context. No, it's actually to correct the effects of the fallacy against. Remember that the fallacy against context is the fallacy of ignoring context.
Yes, please.
And these grand narratives, they ignore context.
Good.
So to correct the effects of the fallacy of ignoring context, you just have to go back to the context to study them, find out what are the contextual conflicts. There are contextual conflicts. If you are practicing the multi-party system and you did not fabricate it yourself, and you know you or your ancestors or elders or predecessors copied it from somewhere across the sea, what the questions you'll be asking are, what context did they copy it from? And into what context did they import it?
Mm-hmm.
These two contexts, don't they merit detailed study? And after these two contexts have been studied, shouldn't a detailed intercontextual comparison be done if indeed we are determined to continue with that system? Otherwise, if we are not ready for such a detailed investigation, then why not just put it aside and we sit down and think out something more original? Yeah, so it's either you went into that very serious task of studying the two societies, or you just shifted the idea aside if you wanted to take another approach and then formulate another idea. Because it is not exactly working. One party will be in power, the other party will say they can do better. When they come, you see that they cannot do better. And then the other party that was there will tell you, you see, we told you we can do better. So remove them. You remove them and bring them back, and they still would be doing it. So you see that the ultimate objective, which is the dividend to the masses, to the voters, is not being achieved. The voters are just voting, but they are not being paid. They are not being rewarded for voting. That is, you are not getting that thing for which you are voting. You are voting because you want your roads and your electricity and all those things to be good. You want your salary to be better. You want the economy to be better. Those things are not happening, but you keep voting. So it means that contexts need to be studied. Up to now, they've been ignored. Somehow it's a fallacy against context. Yes.
Thank you.
If on the other hand, we say, okay, let's just abandon it and then make one of our traditional leaders, the president. If care is not taken, that could also end up as another fallacy against context, because when that position, that traditional position was created, we didn't have national economies. We didn't have a central bank. We didn't have importation. We didn't have so many things, all those institutions that emerged. So none of those things is familiar to that office. You see, so that's another problem. If you want to go that way, then you have to sit down on the drawing board, spend months and possibly years to design how all those things will be run. So whichever way you look, there is work to be done, and we are ignoring that work. Yes, you can't go this way, you can't go the other way. You have to sit down. And nobody is willing to.
Thank you.
Hopefully, if you become a politician, then this lecture would still be fresh on your mind, and you will see the whole work that needs to be done, now we are running a government, we don't really know how to run it. Things are going on and we don't know what to do. Right now, we are owing how much? We are owing, the debt we are owing is equal to 86 point something % of the size of our economy, our total economy. Do you know that the economy is the sum total of all the economic activities that is happening within a territory? And you are owing almost 90% of all that. So that means that gradually the state is going. So now, we right now we are short of time. We need to sit down and start the real work, the work we neglected since independence. We have to sit down and start it now before it's too late. Nkrumah didn't do it, although Nkrumah was good. Nkrumah did enough. At least he secured political independence, so he did enough for a lifetime. Someone else, other people have to do their own work, not just to be occupying offices and earning salaries, driving Land Cruisers and all that. So now, remember Nkrumah was a Marxist. That's another fallacy against context. Yes, so whichever way, whatever it is, there is something that has not been done, and it is related to context. Yes, and it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Doc.
All right. Mr. Lamptey. Or what, okay, it was Rashid that finished speaking.
Yes, please.
Okay, so Mr. Lamptey, you are next.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, sir, and good afternoon to all my colleagues. I would like to take us to a point where you say something about scientists are modernists and humanities are postmodernists. I would like to take us to that page.
Yes.
It's lower, it's below this one.
Yes, let me see.
No. Natural scientists, modernists by procedure, humanity scholars. Postmodernists. I'm just wondering whether even here we are not using a specific cultural context to generalize for everybody. Because in Europe, this may be true, both positions. But in Africa, where our context is different, maybe not all the humanity scholars would be postmodernists in the sense of following the same procedure. There could be other procedures that could fit our context. Yeah. How about that?
Yes, you are right. So this is not supposed to be, this is not meant as an absolute qualification. I think we could say, now remember that in a PowerPoint, you can't write a sentence in full. So if the sentence is to be in full, we'll say, okay, that the natural scientists tended to be modernists, but in the humanities, it is somewhat better. You can say it is better to be a postmodernist, because being a modernist in the humanities will run you into very obvious problems. So I think you are right. There are still modernists in humanities studies, you know. So I think what we can say here is that in the humanities, postmodernism is what resonates more with social studies.
Okay. All right. Thank you, sir.
So I think a little editing will be done to see to that. Yeah, so I hope you enjoyed the class. I'm going to upload the video immediately. And for our next class, we'll be looking at how to be a scholar in the humanities, how to be an author, an accomplished writer and publisher in the humanities, how to be a humanities scholar. So that will be our next class. I will deliver that class too. And then after that class, Dr. Lawrence Boachi will be taking us in hermeneutics as a method in social studies. Remember I mentioned hermeneutics about once or twice in this class. So his own class will be on hermeneutics. Yeah, Mr. Lamptey.
I mean, this issue has come up before, and I'm raising it again. Usually, when the scope is open to humanities, the discussion and the subject line tends to favor the social scientists more, but very little is said about philosophy.
Yeah. Yes, but remember that philosophy falls into the qualitative method. So there has been this qualitative thing about philosophy all the while, even during the modernist era. It is just that the postmodern era enabled other disciplines in social studies to appreciate, the dependence on context. So you see the writings of some of these philosophers, paying a lot of attention to context and those things. So it was there. But remember also that philosophy is the mother of other disciplines. So it's not a surprise that you see qualitative approaches earlier in philosophy. Now, what happened is that the other disciplines in humanities incorporated a qualitative approach in their data gathering approach. Now, remember, philosophers don't gather data, but some other sciences in the humanities need to gather data. So the difference is that their data began to become qualitative data instead of quantitative.
Okay.
Another thing I would say, Mr. Lamptey, is that because we have been qualitative much earlier than other parts of humanities, we probably didn't pay much attention to studying qualitative method as a method. So, for instance, in philosophy, you don't come to philosophy as a discipline and then you see qualitative method as one of the philosophy subjects. So, a philosopher probably hasn't heard of the qualitative method. So it's an irony. It's an irony, but that's actually the center backbone of our discipline.
Yeah. Okay, so thanks.
You can read the book I recommended at the end of the slides so that you can see the details about the qualitative method. But those details are covering both philosophy and other humanities disciplines. Rashidi, do you want to ask another question?
Yes, Doc.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Having followed today's lecture, I'm gathering it in comparison to last week's lecture on the Enlightenment, and especially with the protest of postmodernists against Enlightenment. I am gathering that Enlightenment, and I mean the European Enlightenment, was just a sophisticated form of European barbarism at a different level. Would you agree with me, Doc?
You need to explain what you mean by barbarism so that we see how we can fit it in.
Okay. When you were explaining especially the fundamental flaws of modernism, you explained that they really, especially with structuralism, they don't really think about the context, neither the content. They think about the regularity in the experience and all those things. And the Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment, had brought about a lot of development as we see today, especially with industrial revolution. But as we also observe today, because they have not really thought about the content of experience and the context, it's like their development back then is causing much trouble to us, and we are facing dire consequences, talking about the climate change. So even though we have all these technological development, on the whole, it's just like they have gotten a certain kind of enlightenment which brought about difficulties to humanities as we are now. That's what I'm talking about, barbarism in context. Thank you.
So I see your point. Yeah. I see your point. Let me mute these guys. I'm coming. Let me mute Mr. Lamptey's mic and then, okay, let me also mute your mic. I don't know where the background noise is coming from. So, okay. Yes, so the Enlightenment took place in Europe, although they maximized, they well, the ideas were not entirely theirs. They fed upon the ideas they got from ancient Egypt, China, and some other parts of the world. So there are non-European origins of the European Enlightenment, you know. It also tells you that ideas go from one society to another. You can't really stop the movement of ideas. Now, the Europeans copied from non-Europeans and then developed what they copied. Now we are copying what they have developed. Okay, now they copied from China. China is now copying from them. They are protesting about copyright and all those things. So you copied from me. Now I'm copying from you and all that. But in all that, you needed to pay attention to context. Now, China, of course, we all know China is copying from Europe, but I am also suspecting that China is paying serious attention to its context. China has copied a bit of capitalist economics and added it to its own communist economics. So right now, none of us can tell, and China doesn't want any of us to come and study what they did, how they combined their ideas. So right now, no non-Chinese can say what exactly China's economic ideology is. You can't say how communist or how capitalist it is. You don't know the exact design of the balance. The only thing you know is that it is yielding very marvelous results. China is growing at a rate that is set to overtake US within the next 10 years or thereabout. So just imagine that China becomes the largest economy in the world. They are protecting their own. So my suspicion is that they are copying. That is obvious, but I also suspect that they are paying close attention to their context. They are avoiding the fallacies against context. So before they copy something, they look at their context and see whether they want to apply it or not. So ultimately, a system is doing well when they are doing well, at least when there's something to show for what they are doing. So the fact that we are not doing well means that something is wrong. We need to go back to the drawing board. Now, to your question, Europe developed their ideas and then they tried to generalize those ideas. Unfortunately, that generalization was bought by non-European societies. So we have bought a lot of the ideas from modernism that was developed in Europe. So now that fallacy is what is causing the problems around the world that you have described. The fallacy that we have committed against context by copying modernism. Now, but the opposition to modernism is also coming from Europe. In fact, it is Europeans themselves who are the postmodernists. So Europeans themselves also began to realize that modernism is becoming oppressive. So they started complaining and protesting. So in fact, some Europeans are telling you, look, that don't copy this thing exactly the way it is. You need to look at your context. So both modernism and postmodernism are, coming from Europe, in practical life, when you meet most of these Europeans in conferences, you see that they are postmodernists. If you try to talk about their own systems, maybe the multi-party system, they will deny it, they will denounce it in front of you and even blame you for talking about it, that kind of thing. Europe is, I think Europe is too complex to categorize singly as something like barbaric, because if the protest against modernism is also coming from Europe, then we just take it that Europe is growing from one form to another. They are also humans. They are growing. They grow into this mold, and then they grow into another mold. If we are having problems, and the problems are our fault, it's not their fault. It is not their fault that they came out with the Enlightenment or that they championed modernism. It is our own fault that we picked it, just picked it without doing any work, came home and then started doing it. So they themselves, they are doing well. They are opposing their own modernism, saying that it is too generalizing, it is too oppressive and all that. We ourselves, we should also be opposing modernism and then opposing anything that is doing violence to our systems or our societies or our contexts. So I don't think that it is the best idea to categorize the whole of Europe in a negative form. I think that is rather too emotional. Remember, when you are dealing with Europe, when you are dealing with another society, you don't get emotional. Don't just dismiss them out of hand. Now, look at this, even if you see them as your enemies, you don't exactly deal with your enemies in an emotional way. You have to study your enemy, study him very well so that you can defeat him. If you don't study your enemy, you can't defeat him. So if you dismiss the whole of modernism, how are you going to deal with them? In my personal life, I have been fighting. I have fought so many battles in my life. And I can tell you that I win my battles by studying my enemies. I study my enemies more critically than my enemies study me. So I have more information of my enemies than my enemies have of me. That enables me to anticipate their moves much more than they can anticipate mine. So it ultimately enables me to checkmate them more than they can checkmate me. And if you look internationally, you see that is what China is doing. China is studying Europe very critically because they want to overcome Europe. What are we doing? We are dismissing them as barbaric and this and that. Is that how we are going to fight? So that's my response to that. Let's not be too nationalistic in our approach to these things. We have to control ourselves a little bit. I heard some of you saying things in the last class. Some of you said they felt hollow, you felt this. What use is that? They are actually coming back to colonize you again. If your debt exceeds 100% of the size of your economy, you are back to colonialism. By then you stop feeling hollow because then you will be under direct control. You wouldn't even have the time to feel anything. So we need to be very logical, very systematic, very calculated in our approach, because at the worst, we are dealing with enemies, serious enemies. When you are dealing with serious enemies, you have to be very, very alert, mentally disciplined and all that. I'm married. So like when I get home, I discuss with my wife. Now, if I'm discussing my enemies with my wife, sometimes my wife will be saying, oh, these people are so stupid. These people are that, these people are that. My wife will be saying, these people are oppressive, these people are this, these people are that. Sometimes I'll tell her, look, I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that because I'm thinking of my next move, how I will defend myself. I'm thinking of my next move, how I'm going to overcome. So I have no use for you to come and tell me these people are this, these people are that. It doesn't help me to prepare myself for the next round or the next battle. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes, Doc. I perfectly understand you, and I agree with the points you have made completely. But then the question I asked, you answered it, and you said, like, the Enlightenment was a stage in their progress. And that was what I was also asking. I was not describing all of them like barbarian. That's why I said I use that term in context. They were growing. At the time they came to colonize us, they were also still growing, and they are still growing. So we, the colonized ones, we also have the opportunity to grow and not remain stuck at one place with whatever we have copied from them. That's all I'm just drawing our attention to.
Yes, yes, it's fine. Yes, it's fine. Actually, the Germans themselves, you know, you actually have a point about the barbarism, because the Germans were barbaric for a very long. The Germans in particular were barbaric for centuries. I can tell you that the German barbarism stopped after the Second World War. You know, there was a time, a period called the period of German barbarism. You know, you've heard of the German barbarians, you know.
Yes,
so
please.
they
Yes.
were there. They were there for. So the Germans were essentially barbaric people for centuries, you know, and you know that thing was still in them, and it was part of what caused the First World War. You know, now the First World War, it was essentially many countries against Germany. Many countries were concerned about Germany's the superiority feeling of the Germans. You know, the Germans felt that they are the most superior people on earth. So everybody was concerned. That was actually what was being sorted out in the First World War. And so the Germans were defeated in this First World War, and they felt humiliated by that defeat. Adolf Hitler said his life mission was to address the humiliation of Germany during the First World War. So Adolf Hitler wanted to correct the humiliation that Germany received by being defeated at the First World War. You know, and then Adolf Hitler wanted to go beyond that. He wanted to conquer the whole Europe, which he actually achieved. He went as far as France, Portugal, and then in the East, he reached an agreement with Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, that they will not invade each other, so that they can divide up all the states in Eastern Europe. So they divided the states in Eastern Europe. Joseph Stalin of Soviet Union took, you know, a number of those states there, took the eastern half of Poland. Then Adolf Hitler took the western half of Poland, and then all the other Eastern European states between Russia and Germany. And then Hitler became the master of the whole of Europe. The only European country he couldn't conquer was UK, because UK was separated by the sea. You know, UK was an island. If UK was part of the main continental Europe, it probably would have overrun UK. You know, so now as time went on, Adolf Hitler started looking at Russia, telling himself he can conquer Russia. And Joseph Stalin was afraid. He knew that Adolf Hitler can strike anytime. So eventually Adolf Hitler struck, and the battle started. They fought it for about 4 years. You know, 4.5 million Germans. They went there. They slaughtered almost 20 million Russian soldiers. But the population of Russia, the Soviet Union, was simply too much. So, you know, it couldn't work. It's just like when the Fulanis wanted to take over Central African Republic. You know, the Fulanis were too few, no matter how sophisticated they were. So eventually they had to run. So the Germans became tired, ran out of ammunition, ran out of everything. I mean, the population difference was simply too much. And then they were vanquished, they were conquered. And Russia came from the east. The United States and UK came from the west. In fact, many countries were trying to put the Germans in their proper place. So America, Britain, they were bombing, destroying Germany from the west. Russia was coming from the east. And then they all met in Berlin. And by the end of the Second World War, the whole of Germany was in shambles. There was hardly a single building that was standing. So no country had ever suffered such a destruction. That is actually what, in my view, that is actually what ended German barbarism. After that, they became gentlemen and gentlewomen up till today.
Thank you very much.
In fact, they have a softer disaster than the British. The British are now more difficult than the Germans. The Germans took so many people in, so many refugees during the Syrian war and all those things. They took a lot of people in, more than other, until it began to cause problems, you know. So that was it. They were barbaric for a very long time. So I agree with you. But you see, they were also growing. Experience made them to come out of it, you know.
Yes, thank you very
Haruna.
much.
Is it Haruna? Yes, that's Haruna.
Yeah, Doc, it's Haruna. Yeah, Doc, I really appreciate your teaching today, and it's helping me to do a bit more reflection, even within my own discipline, within the studies of religions. And I now understand why, even because of the way modernity was trying to explain everything within its own set of laws and so forth and so on, now helps me to understand why even the definition of religion is even quite complex, because you have religions within their own context. And I mean, researchers or scholars are trying to use these grand principles to describe and define all religions, irrespective of their own context. And that creates a lot of problems. And you could see that even much of research that has been done in recent times, even when you look at theology and so forth and so on, they appreciate more of qualitative, because the emphasis in theology is more on qualitative. You know, so you hear about African theologians and so forth and so on trying to look at religion from their own point of view, even with respect to Christianity and the African traditional religions. But in recent times, even right now, in our own department, some of the courses we are being asked to take has to do with quantitative. And we all know from the little you've said, in order to be charitable, quantitative method appear to be at variance with qualitative. I mean, and here's the case, we are taking this course, and at the end of the day, they will appreciate if we are able to give a balance. I mean, hoping that quantitative research approach will be quite important for us in our thesis and so forth and so on. But this is methods that are at variance. And I'm looking at the problems that this, trying to put these together in your own thesis, and how, you know, I'm beginning to envisage the conflict, you know, where I'm supposed to employ all these two, where they think that it will be very relevant for me. For example, how can one use quantitative research approach in religious studies to measure transformation? I mean, you're looking at spiritual transformation and so forth and so on. And for me, I would have gone for qualitative, but here's the case, maybe your supervisors would at a point in time may want to coach you to see to it that you use certain, you know, quantitative approach in some of your work. And I'm seeing that this is going to be cumbersome and very difficult terrain to maneuver, having to balance these two. It's just a comment and probably your own take, your views on this.
Yes, it's a very important point. Whilst you were talking, I remembered the name given to the department to the religion department. Now, a lot of religion departments are called the Department of Religion, but the one we have in Legon, the title of the department is the Department for the Study of Religions. For the study of religions. So that title tells you that there was a serious issue with studying religion, just religion, and at a point, members of the department felt that saying it is a department of religion is a, is a kind of generalization, Some people, some scholars like Kwesiwuredu have even argued that what Africa practiced before Europe came cannot be called religion. That is going by the meaning of religion in Europe, So they said, okay, we should call it the Department for the Study of Religions, because each religion has its own context, doctrines, and, norms, values, and all kinds of things. So you see the postmodern approach reflecting in the name of that department, the Department for the Study of Religions. And then another thing, in your research, coming to your research, if, for instance, you are, because I remember there's someone in the Department for the Study of Religions. He was discussing his PhD thesis with me, and he's looking at a certain trend that is beginning to emerge in the Pentecostal. In Pentecostal churches, some pastors said they can cure HIV, AIDS, and some of that illness. So he's studying that, and in order for him to study that, he has to go and gather data from those who are concerned, the pastors themselves, and then the people who have been cured. He has to interview them. So obviously, you can see he's going to need the qualitative method, because he wants the pastors to offer explanations behind what they are doing. And he has no idea what those explanations will be. So he cannot sit down and say, you'll be answering yes or no, yes or no. Did you do this, yes or no? Did you not do that? No, that's quantitative. What he needs is qualitative. You need to ask them, you said you cured this person. Yes. How? What did you do? So it's a qualitative approach. You want to find out a lot of things about the pastor, and then a lot of things about those that were cured, So obviously he needs the qualitative approach, but if he is also to look at the number of pastors that are in that category, and then the number of those with that experience, then somehow you also see the quantitative approach. You also want to look at the number of those who have had this experience, or the number of those who have had this power. You want to say 10 pastors have this power. You want to say 2,000 people have had this experience, those things. So you can see the qualitative approach, which is the most obvious, the most prominent method in that research. But if care is not taken, he might need the quantitative approach. I'm not saying he will need it. I'm just saying he might, because he may never need it. It's possible he may not need it. He may just study 3 pastors and 10 beneficiaries, those who were cured. 3 pastors and 10 beneficiaries, that's all. So qualitative approach is fine. So that is how the 2 methods interplay in your research. So when you are dealing with your supervisor and you are discussing with your supervisor which approach to use at different times, remember that the approach depends on the part of the research. Your research has different parts. One part may need qualitative, the other part may need quantitative, So you are looking at your research in different aspects. It is when you look at what is needed in that aspect of your research that you then ask, is it the qualitative? Is this qualitative or is this quantitative, So you shouldn't allow your supervisor to just impose, something and say, okay, do it this way. It should arise, from need. The research method in question should be need-based. It should be based on the fact that it is actually needed in this specific aspect of your research. Okay, so it looks like...
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right, so it looks like we are, if no one else is asking any other thing, then we would end.
I think there's someone, Joshua Otabel.
Okay.
Joshua Otabel's hand is up.
Yeah, Joshua, you can go ahead. Yeah, Joshua, are you ready?
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yes, Joshua, you can go ahead.
Okay. Drawing from your answer on the qualitative and then the quantitative, you said that he can also use a little bit of qualitative and a little of the quantitative. So does that make it to be a mixed method? And if it's a mixed method, how then do you draw a balanced conclusion?
Yes, so that question is somehow what I was trying to address. Now, you cannot decide before your research or ahead of time or in this class how mixed it is going to be, or how, what ratio it will be between the quantitative and the qualitative. There's no template, the point I'm making is that it is when you look at the nature of your research, what your research needs. I give an example with someone who wants to study the emergence of miracle syndrome in Pentecostal churches. The person wants to know how AIDS or HIV is cured by some pastors. So obviously you see that what he needs is qualitative. Basically, what he wants to do is to go and listen to the stories of the pastors, and so it is not a yes or no. He is not going to write a yes or no questionnaire. You have to write a questionnaire. Now, his questionnaire is not going to be a yes or no. It is going to be consist of open-ended questions. Please, can you explain how you do this? That's an open-ended question. So by definition, such a question is qualitative. So can I do this? But what if you are interested in another topic? Probably there's another topic in the humanities where you need a greater presence of quantitative. So you see that in topic A, you are using almost completely, topic A is relying almost completely on qualitative method. And then topic B, probably in another humanities discipline, has to bring in more of the quantitative approach. There was this research I read in psychology. When, for instance, you go to psychology, they study, what do you call it? Let me see. I'm trying to remember something I read in that, they wanted to find out those who are hardworking, and those who are sycophants, which of them progresses more in life? That kind of study, first of all, the topic is very broad. So you need a more quantitative, you need to interview more people, because whatever conclusions you make will have a lot of ramifications. So you study, and so they studied 6,000 persons, 6,000 persons. You know, so if you are going to interview 6,000 persons, that means the quantitative approach is inevitable, because at a point you see that computation is necessary, you know. So, and to study 6,000 persons, you need to ask certain yes and no questions. What are you doing now? What is in your account balance? That is, how much money do you have now at this point in your life? How many years are you? I'm 45 years. How much are you worth? I'm worth $1 million. I'm worth 100 cities. How much were you worth in the last 10 years ago? I was worth this, you know, those kinds of things. So already you see that the study is more quantitative, but it's still in the humanities. You know, so that means that it varies from topic to topic. This other topic about the emergence of miracle working among pastors. The person just wants to interview 3 pastors, you know, and then he will do his research. His study is just limited to Accra. He wants to study 3 or 5 pastors. That's all. You don't need to calculate. No, are you going to calculate 5? Then the other people, the psychologists, they want to study 6,000 people. Those 6,000 people, by the time they finish their computations, they will know whether it is hardworking people or sycophants that progress more in life. So that means that the question of how qualitative and how quantitative should be answered after you have chosen your topic, mapped out your strategies and all that, you know. So that's my answer to your question, Joshua.
Okay, thank you, Doc.
Yeah, so you can see that we cannot, sit here and say, oh, it is going to be 50% quantitative, 50% qualitative, and then you pass it on to the guy who wants to study pastors. You tell him you are going to be quantitative, but he has only 5 pastors to study. And then you also tell the other people, the psychologists, these 6,000 persons, you are going to be 50% qualitative. But they cannot be 50% qualitative for 6,000 persons. If you want to be qualitative for 6,000 persons, you will do it your whole life and pass the research to your children, who will continue, because you can't finish it. Remember that qualitative studies require you to sit down with someone and hear the person's story. The person has to take time to tell you his entire mind. That's the qualitative method. You are looking for content, and content takes time. All right, so thank you very much for attending. We are happy we have come to the end of today's class. So now I'm going to end the meeting and start uploading the video. So I wish you all a very nice day.
Thank you. Thank you very
Doc.
much.
Thank you very much, Doc.
Bless you.
Thank you, Doc.
All right.